Hello class, this is your instructor, Miss Birchfield. In this mini lesson, we're going to solve equations by factoring. And what we're going to do is use those factoring methods in order to break down the polynomials so that we can determine the solutions to the equations. So the purpose of factoring and learning how to factor was to get us to this point here. So how do you solve an equation by factoring? In order to solve an equation, and the difference with these, you're going to see the previous lessons about factoring were just polynomials. And these particular ones, you're going to have an actual equation. And remember, anytime you have an equal sign, it is an equation. So to solve an equation by factoring, what we need to do is get everything on one side equal to 0. And once we do this, what we want to determine is what method of factoring we will need to use. Of course, remember we've got GCF, grouping, slip and slide diamond, difference of two squares, or perfect cube. Once we make that decision, then once we factor, we will set each factor that contains a variable equal to 0, and then we will solve the resulting equation. So this first example here, we've got everything on one side equal to 0, which is how we want the equation set up. Notice how we've already got factors here. So we already have this broken down into, this is all multiplication. So for this particular equation, all we have to do is set each factor with a variable, set it equal to 0, and then we solve the resulting linear equation. So remember your steps. What I'm going to do is I'm going to rearrange by doing the opposite. And then I'm going to divide by the coefficient so that I have a 1 in front now. And that gives us one of the solutions to the equation. I'm going to rearrange. I'm going to bring down my 4x. And then I'm going to divide by 4, and I get -3/4. So it's okay to leave your answer like this, but you will also see these solutions in what's called a solution set, where they will write each answer separated by a comma. And in this case, there's two solutions. Now, a lot of time we did the linear equations, and linear had the one solution for the most part. If you were to pull this out, and you just looking at this first term, if I fold that out, I would get 8x squared. Well, this equation, if I fold it all out and got the polynomial, I would see, okay, that's a degree of 2. So that tells me how many answers I should have. In example B, we're going to solve the equation. See, notice it's got the equal sign. I want to make sure it's equal to 0, so this one is set up already. The next thing I'm going to do is look at the terms, determine if I have a GCF. I do not. And then after I determine that, I'm going to look to see, okay, it's a trinomial, so I'm going to use slip and slide because it's a quadratic. So remember, slip and slide, you do the split. Well, of course, 1 times 24 is going to just leave us with 24. And then remember the bottom quarter of your diamond or x, we will put this coefficient of the middle term. Since I have a plus and a plus, I know both of my numbers are going to be positive. So what will multiply to 24 and add to 11? Well, that's going to be 8 and 3. So now we can write out our factors. So in the previous lesson on factoring trinomials, this is all we did at this point. But now it's an equation. So what we're doing with this point is taking these factors and we're setting them equal to 0 so that we can find our solutions. So we have x equals -8. And then we're going to rearrange again, and we have x equals -3. So look at the highest exponent. It's a 2, so we have two solutions, -8 and a -3. So example C, I'm looking at the equation, and notice here I've got a 2, so that tells me I'm going to have 2 solutions. I've got it equal to 0, and I don't have a GCF, so what I'm going to do here is use the slip and slide method again. And now I'm going to place it in my diamond. So 12 times a negative 2 is a negative 24. And I'm going to put that coefficient of the middle term down at the bottom. Since I have a minus, I know I'm going to subtract. So my 2 factors that I'm going to put here and here, I'm going to have one that's positive and one that's negative. The larger number is going to be positive because of the 5 here. It's positive. So what combination of factors for 24 would subtract to give us 5? Those 2 factors are going to be a positive 8 and a negative 3, because 8 times negative 3 is a negative 24, and then 8 minus 3 is 5. So we're going to place, that should be a positive 8. We're going to replace those 2 factors in our parentheses, and then we are going to slide the 12 underneath, and I'm going to reduce. So when I reduce the factors here, this is going to reduce to 2 over 3 and 1 over 4. And since I still have a fraction, I'm going to slide again the bottom number in front of the variable. And that gives us our factors. Now the previous sections, again, this would be as far as we would go. But remember, we are equaling it to 0, so we have to solve it. So I am going to set each factor equal to 0, and I'm going to solve the resulting equation. So we're rearranging and dividing. So x equals negative 2/3 is one of our solutions. I'm going to rearrange by adding 1. I'm going to divide by 4. And I'm going to get x equals 1/4. So the solutions here are a negative 2/3 and a positive 1 over 4. Example D is an equation. I want to solve it. Now, if I were to try to think about getting x by itself, well, notice if I were to get x squared and x together, you would not be able to combine them because they're not like terms. So in this particular problem, since I have an exponent that's higher than a 1, that clues me in I'm going to have to break this down by factoring. But the first thing I need to do is I need it equal to 0. So what I'm going to do is I am going to rearrange the 10x. I'm going to put them in descending order so that I have everything on one side. Now that I have everything on one side equal to 0, I can determine what method of factoring to use. I don't have a GCF. This is a trinomial, so I'm going to use the slip and slide method. I'm going to slip the 1 times the 9. It's going to give us a 9 in the top quarter of the diamond, and I'm going to put this negative 10 down at the bottom. Since I have a plus, I know I'm going to add. Now remember, when you add numbers, it's the same sign. Well, in order for me to get a negative over here, both of my numbers have to be negative. So if I'm thinking about factors of 9 that would add to a negative 10, a negative 9 and a negative 1 would add to a negative 10, and a negative 9 times a negative 1 is a positive 9. So I'm going to break my factors down into x minus 9 and x minus 1. Remember, you're equaling it to 0. So now that you've factored, you've got to take each factor and equal them to 0. So I'm going to add. Now, I missed a step here. We slipped. Remember, you do slide, but since it's a 1, remember the 1 does not change your numbers. So we're going to end up with x equal to 9. I'm going to add 1, and I'm going to get x equal 1. So our solutions are 9 and 1. This last example, I'm going to erase this. We are going to solve, and if you look at this, notice that this is not a linear equation, and the reason it's not a linear because of the 3 here. It's a degree of 3. That tells me I'm going to have 3 solutions, but in order to solve a polynomial, what I need to do is get everything on one side equal to 0. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move or rearrange the 25x squared. Now remember, you can't put those together because they are not like terms. So I'm just going to write it out, my polynomial out, equal it to 0. Now I'm going to decide what method of factoring to use. I'm going to always check GCF. Well, we do have a GCF. We have 5 and then x squared that's common to both terms. Remember, you do start your parentheses and then we divide. I'm going to divide and get x minus 5 in the parentheses equal to 0. After checking GCF, I always want to check this in here to make sure that it doesn't factor. Well, x minus 5 is factored. I mean, that's as far as it's going to go. So what we're going to do is, and you can't break down this monomial, so we're going to take each factor with the variables. So I've got 5x squared equal to 0, and I've got x minus 5 equal to 0. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to solve. I'm going to divide by 5. Well, 0 divided by any number is 0. And to get rid of the square, I would technically just have to do the square root. Really, the square root is a plus or minus 0. Well, 0 is neither positive or negative, so we just get x equal to 0 for that particular solution. Here we're going to add 5. So the solutions here, I would, this, remember, is a 3. I technically should have 3 answers, but I only have 2. Now, where would the third one be? Well, keep in mind, let's say this number was not a 0 right here. Let's say it was a 9. I would end up having a positive 3 and a negative 3 as an answer. But remember, since 0 is neither positive or negative, we're only going to have 0. So really, if I counted the positive and the negative, that would give me 3 answers there. Well, I hope this lesson has helped. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email to ask. Thank you very much.